All right, so today's class is going to be basically an overview of MIDI, and we're going to start off with a little history of MIDI, an introduction to MIDI, like what MIDI does, what MIDI is, what it's not, what it doesn't do, those kinds of things. And then in the second half, we're going to talk about MIDI and Pro Tools specifically, and I'm going to show you how to make some music in Pro Tools. And we're not going to get everything into Pro Tools today. We're just going to start looking at it, and we're going to get you going on some stuff. So really, by the end of your lessons today, you'll know mostly how to do the MIDI exercise, but I don't expect you to have it done for today. It's going to take today and tomorrow's lesson to really understand everything about the MIDI exercise that I want you all to do. So let's go ahead and get started with that. First of all, MIDI, the big misunderstanding about MIDI is that MIDI cables actually transmit audio data. That's a really big misunderstanding, and a lot of people think that MIDI is audio. MIDI is like when you hit a key on your keyboard, it's making it's playing the sound from the keyboard and it's going through the MIDI cables, and that can't be further from the truth. It's just a communication thing for pieces of gear to talk to each other. MIDI was actually developed in the early 80s. 1984 was when the MIDI was published. 1983 was when it was proposed. It was proposed by a guy named Dave Smith, and you probably recognize his name from DSI, Dave Smith Instruments. He makes the Prophet, he makes the modern OB6, a lot of really cool modern synthesizers today. He worked on the Tempest with who's the dude who made the MPC? I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but he's been doing a lot of stuff. And he's been really active, super smart dude. And he's the guy who proposed MIDI, the idea of MIDI. And what was happening was in the 70s, a lot of keyboard companies were making different keyboards, and the keyboards were starting to become digital, and they were starting to get cheaper. And he could see a future where more and more people would have home studios because these keyboards were getting into the price range where normal human beings could have them. And he said, hey, why don't we, instead of everybody having their own system for communication, why don't we make one system for communication? And in the modern world, this would be kind of like if Xbox, PlayStation, and Nintendo all got together and they said, hey, let's make one controller that we can use with all of our systems. As we know, that's probably not going to happen, but that's what it would kind of be like if they all sat down and said, hey, let's make it so they can all talk to each other and they can all work together. That's probably not something that's going to happen anytime really soon, but that would be really cool if it did happen, right? So, Roger Lynn, yes, thank you very much. Thanks. Yep, that's awesome. Yeah, Roger Lynn, big fan, but my memory is not good, so I'm bad with names. So, communication, MIDI is a communication thing just for all these different pieces of gear to talk to each other. And everything that can control stuff or play sounds or whatever, almost everything that's in the professional world has MIDI in it. Anything that I would say, anything that costs over $100 or $100 and up will have some kind of MIDI communication. Now, it doesn't always mean that it's going to have a MIDI port, which is what we're going to talk about right now. But before we talk about MIDI ports, let me just show you what a MIDI cable looks like. And here we go. Whoops, not over there. Wrong. Over here, MIDI cable. So these are what MIDI cables look like, and here's a good one to look at right here. This is what a MIDI cable looks like, and you can see it's like a 5-pin cable, and it doesn't look like any audio cables that you have, so there's no question that you would ever plug in a MIDI cable into an audio cable. There are some modern MIDI cables that look like this over here that have a little 1/8" jack in them. That's something that you're seeing on some controllers, like smaller things, and that one you could accidentally plug into an 1/8" jack. It's a weird one. I've actually, see if I ever used a MIDI cable like that. I guess I have. I have some stuff from IK Multimedia, and they tend to like those things. The little small controllers from IK Multimedia, they use them, but I don't really use them that much. Most gear that I have has a regular MIDI cable on it, and if we look, for example, if I pull up my MPC, here, let me just unplug this MPC. And if I pull this MPC up, and you can see on my camera here. Let's just see if I can make this big for you. There we go. So this one here has these ports there. See that? Those are MIDI ports. And here are USB ports. Now, the thing about USB and MIDI, and a lot of people don't really understand this about USB. USB is just a general connector for all kinds of stuff. It's not particularly for any one thing in particular. It's you can use USB for audio, you can use USB for MIDI, you can use USB for printers, you can use USB for everything. It's just a general thing. And when USB first came out in the end of the 90s, and the first computers to really embrace USB were the iMacs. If you remember those candy colored iMacs that were all the different colors and they looked like little TV sets. Well, those are the first ones to only have USB. And so you'll see USB on the back of your controllers and stuff like I just showed you on the back of my MPC there, but that doesn't mean that it's transmitting audio through that USB cable. You can transmit audio through a USB cable, but if it's MIDI data that's being transmitted, then it's just MIDI, it's not audio. Okay, so that's something that's kind of important to understand and kind of keep in your brain there when we're talking about all this stuff. So if we are talking about basic MIDI ports, then there are three types of ports here. There's the in, the out, and the through. And remember when we were talking about our test the other day, we kind of mentioned about all these, and I said we'd come back and talk about them. Well, here we are. We're back. We're talking about them. The in, the out, and the through ports. The in port receives MIDI data. The out port transmits MIDI data. And the through port also transmits MIDI data. But the difference between the out and the through, let me just see if I've got this other one here. Here we go. This picture right here shows us the difference between the out and the through. What happens is, if the MIDI data is generated within that device, within that piece of hardware, it's going to go out of the out port. But we can connect up multiple devices together in what we call a daisy chain. So in this case here, I've got my controller. It's sending MIDI data out of the out port, and these are connected up with a cable, and it comes into the in port. So the in port is receiving the data, and the out port is transmitting the data from the keyboard controller. So if there's any knobs or notes or anything like that, it's going to be in there. Then what happens is that MIDI data actually just gets copied from the in port directly to the through port. So it's exactly the same MIDI data that goes to the through port and goes into the next one. And that data gets copied from the in port to the through and goes to the next one, and from the in to the through, if I had another one in this picture here. But you can see here on my screen, I've got the in port here, and I got the through port over here, and in the middle I have the out port. Well, you see these knobs that are on this module right here? If these knobs can transmit MIDI data, if they generate MIDI data, some of them do, some of them don't, it depends on the hardware. If they transmit MIDI data, then that MIDI data that's being created by these knobs here, that's going to go out of the out port. And that's the difference between the out and the through. The out port is for internally generated MIDI data, and the through port is just copying it from the in port. So the through port is not coming from this module here, it's coming from this keyboard over here, the controller. So the data goes over here through the cable, goes to the in port, and then the module may do something with it, it might not do something with it, and then it gets copied to the through port, and it goes to the next module down here. And that's what we're talking about here in this first page. The in receives the MIDI data, the out transmits or sends MIDI data, and the through copies the MIDI data from the in port. Okay? Now, it's not super important that you understand exactly what it's doing 100%. You can explain it to somebody else. But it's really just important that you understand if you are connecting multiple devices together, you have to go from the out to the in, and then from the through to the in, and from the through to the in. And really, all you have to do realistically is just look at this diagram and then just copy this diagram. And so that'll get you going in the right direction. Okay, so we have in this image here a controller that's connected up to a sound module. Now, sound modules look like this. Let's go ahead and look at a sound module. MIDI sound module. Boop. This is what a MIDI sound module looks like. They come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, and nowadays they're still all sorts of shapes and sizes. So we've got this one here, which is like a Roland SH101, or it's called a Roland SH01A. Over here, you've got an XV2020. You've got here JU06A. Here's one from Electron Analog. It's like a synth drum machine thing. You got this one here. It's M-Audio Accent. I don't know what that is. Over here, Korg Triton Rack. This here is like a really basic sound module, Studio Canvas from Roland. And as you can see, like I said, they come in all shapes and sizes. And if we start to go into modern, I mean, these are all modern-ish. But what we could also do is let's look up analog synthesizer. And if we start looking at some of these, we'll see that analog synthesizers, which are very modern, they come in all sorts of shapes and sizes as well. So we got these here. I'm just going to go through and click on a bunch of different types here. This is an old one here. This is a micro Korg. It's not exactly analog. Behringer Odyssey, the Manther synth. I don't know what that is. Here's a Korg mini log. This is very modern. And you can see they're all, like, most of these have keyboards in them. They don't have to have a keyboard in it. Here's a Korg monologue, which is pretty cool. Here's the Moog 1 here. If you want to spend some money, this thing costs, what, like $8,000, I think. It's pretty expensive. Let's see if we have analog module. Oh, we're going to start getting, okay, wait, hold on. Analog synth module. There we go. Not videos. Hold on, let's go back to images. Okay, so these ones are the same as what we were just looking at. They just don't have keyboards. And this is really what we would use MIDI for a lot. I mean, MIDI, what it allows you to do is it allows you to connect up a keyboard to something like this, and you can play the keys on your keyboard, and you can get the sounds out of this here. So there's a whole bunch of different types of analog synth modules, and they all, again, they come in different shapes and sizes. And we're going to talk more about this stuff when we talk about synthesizers and we get into sound design and stuff like that. We're going to get into this and kind of go over more of these when we talk about that. But I just wanted to kind of show you basic stuff. Another thing that's really popular for, you know, in MIDI stuff is MIDI drum machines. And these are some different MIDI drum machines. This is actually a sampler, but you can use it as a drum machine. Here's some drum machines here. There's not so many anymore. There used to be more drum machines out on the market, but usually people who are doing drums, they're usually doing them from inside a computer these days. So really not too many people are using hardware drum machines anymore, but they still exist. And you can still buy old ones, like this one here. Here's the Oberheim DX drum machine. It's one of the very first ones that was ever made. Super cool sound. Here's another one, the MC500, which is a really old one as well. So you can still buy these. You know, here's the MPC. Here's an MPC 60. Here's an MPC Renaissance, which is actually a controller. And we're going to talk about all this stuff. Here is the Audio Realism drum machine. It's got like a little, you can see a little screen on it and stuff. So, yeah, an expensive field. AJ, yeah, we can. I mean, I know you've already gone down that rabbit hole a little bit. We can certainly continue that rabbit hole, especially if you get into analog synths and modular synthesizers. You know, before you even know, you've dropped 10 grand and you've got like a few boxes with a bunch of cables. It looks like a telephone operator's thing. So it's, yeah, definitely an expensive world. So one thing about MIDI cables, when you're connecting up MIDI cables from your controller to your sound module, is you will always connect the MIDI cable from the out to the in. It's like, you think about how anything flows. Things always flow out to in. They always go out of something into something else. So out of your sink faucet into your glass, out of your hose into your swimming pool or into your slip and slide, you know, whatever. It always goes from out to in. So yeah, you definitely have, AJ. Oh, definitely fall into that rabbit hole. So it's the same thing with this. When you plug in a MIDI cable and you're connecting up stuff, you have to go from an out to an in or from a through to an in, because remember, through is also an out. Now, if you connect it up wrong, if you connect up from an out to an out or an in to an in, it's not going to do anything bad. It's not going to break anything. It doesn't create a feedback loop because there's no audio. It's not going to do anything. It's not going to break anything, but nothing will happen. So that's just what you have to kind of keep in mind. If you're not hearing anything and you've got stuff connected up and you think it's correct, but it's not working, the first thing I always recommend that people do is check the cables. Are you plugged in from an out to an in? There have been plenty of times when I've been, in my studio and I had unplugged stuff for whatever reason. Maybe I went to play a live show or something and I plugged stuff back in, and it's like behind a wall of rack stuff, and I'm playing stuff and nothing's happening, and I go back and I realize, oh, it was dark, and I was fumbling around from the back or from the front, and I just plugged it into the wrong port. Not a big deal. You just got to flip it to the right port. All right. So there are different types of data that travel through MIDI cables. There's basically two types. There's musical and then there's utility. If we look over here, here's the musical data here, or utility or global data down here. Two types of data that go through. Musical is most of it. That's your note numbers, which is pitch, velocity, which is how hard or soft you hit the key, control change data, which is your knobs and faders, buttons, stuff like that, and then program change data, which allows you to choose different instruments without having to go into your computer or something like that. Utility or global data is your clock sync. If I have, like I showed you, I've got this MPC here. The MPC has its own sequencer. I can make beats inside the MPC, which I'm going to show you when we start talking about samplers and stuff. If I want to plug that up to my computer, so I hit play on my computer and it plays my MPC, I have to use the clock sync for that. SysX data, system exclusive data, is what you can use for backing up your synthesizers and stuff if you want to save your presets that are stored on your synth, or even on your effects. Like if you have a nice reverb, like a lexicon reverb or some delay or something like that, a lot of those can actually back up their presets with SysX data, which is pretty cool stuff. All right. All right, a couple more MIDI basics here. MIDI channels. There are MIDI channels in MIDI. These are not things that you see, but they are things that you're gonna see on your screen. These are basically lanes that carry MIDI data. Kind of like a highway. On a highway, let's say you have a giant highway going into and out of a city. Maybe it's a 4-lane highway or a 6-lane highway. Well, that highway, each lane carries cars and trucks and motorcycles. These are all vehicles and they're all taking people places. They're all basically the same thing. They are all like basically transportation. They get you from point A to point B. Well, on a highway, you're going to have different shapes and sizes. Big trucks, big cars, little cars, motorcycles. And they're all going to go to different places, but they're all carrying passengers. That's exactly the same with a MIDI channel. A MIDI channel is a lane that the musical data and the data flows through. So each lane, there can be 16 lanes per port. So if I have a MIDI cable, do I have a MIDI cable here? I do not have a MIDI cable right here. But let's say I have a MIDI cable, and that MIDI cable can transmit 16 channels of MIDI data at one time. Those channels do not overlap with each other, so channel 1 stays on channel 1, channel 2 stays on channel 2, channel 3 stays on channel 3, and each MIDI channel is its own instrument. So it's got its own MIDI data, like notes that you're playing. If it's a drum kit, it's going to have a boom, bap type of thing going on with it. You can have different notes. They can have different keys. You can have different control change, like knobs and faders and stuff like that happening. But it's just for one sound at a time, one instrument. So if it's a piano, it's a piano. If it's a bass, it's a bass. If it's a string sound, like a violin, and you're playing violin stuff with it, it's not also a guitar, it's just a violin. So like a piano could be on MIDI channel 1, a guitar could be on MIDI channel 2, a bass could be on MIDI channel 3, things like that. So that's MIDI channels. There's 16 of those per port, and it's one instrument at a time per channel. And we're gonna revisit this in a little bit and kind of talk about this some more. All right, let's talk a little bit more about our hardware. We talked about sound modules, and that's most of what everything is. And you can see over here, this is called a device. A sound module is a device, And basically in the MIDI world, you have different devices. And those can be anything like synthesizers, a sound module, which is just the box with no keyboard. A synth generally would have a keyboard with it, but not always. A sampler, which is going to store the sounds in it, like audio sounds, and then a drum machine, which usually has like pads, like a MPC. So just in my studio right here, let me just pull up this. Let me just pull up this Here we go. So here's this. Wait, this. Okay. So check this out. In my studio here, I'm just going to lift these up for you so you can see. So this here is a sampler, and it's got pads like a drum machine. See, I've got 16 pads here. 16 pads like a drum machine. So each one of these can play different sounds and stuff like that. But this here is actually a sampler. And the reason why it's a sampler is because I can record my own sounds into it. You can see here, it's got there you go, input. It's got inputs and outputs. It's not, there we go. So you got inputs and outputs. See there's my input right there. There's my output right there. It's backwards, so it's not going to read correctly, but you see what I'm talking about. That's my sampler. And if I lift this up here, this is a keyboard controller. This one here is a keyboard controller. It does not have any sounds on it. And I don't need to lift it up. I could just show you with the other keyboard, the other camera, but whatever. I'm already lifting it up. It's just USB. It doesn't actually have any sounds in it. It just plays notes. Now compare that to this one over here. This is a synthesizer. This has knobs and stuff on it, just like the other one does, but this actually generates sounds. And the back of this one looks a bit different from the back of the other one. This one actually has output here. See, that says output. Let's see, will it focus? Will you focus? There we go, output. It's backwards, I know, but you get the idea. Wow, it's really heavy, goodness. Ugh. Whereas this one here, let me pull this one back up. Come on, there we go. No outputs. It's got a pedal thing there for a foot pedal. Sorry, it's not. Let's see, can I make it? Nope, I can't. But it doesn't have any outputs. It's just got that MIDI cable in the back. And the reason why it doesn't have any outputs is because it's not it doesn't have any audio. It's just a controller. Okay, so over here under devices, that controller is actually not represented. It's just, we've got synthesizers, sound modules, samplers, drum machines. And you could actually, I could write in here a keyboard controller, which would be that there. Controllers come in all different shapes and sizes. Here's another controller here, right there. So, I've got all different shapes and sizes of controllers. You can even have controllers that look like DJ setups and stuff like that. I mean, all sorts of different shapes and sizes. Like literally, if you can dream it up, somebody's probably made it. I've got a drum cat at home that's just drum pads and stuff like that. So lots of different shapes and sizes of controllers. And then the sound modules that make the sound are the synth sound modules, or samplers, drum machines, stuff like that. Inside of a device, so that's the device, that's the hardware. Inside of a device, you have instruments or programs. In the MIDI world, they are called programs. So when you hear somebody talk about a program, they're talking about the instrument inside of a device, inside of a keyboard or synth. And that's the sound here. And that could be a piano, it could be a bass, it could be a drum kit, it could be strings, it could be sound effects, whatever it is. And it's going to shift depending on what kind of synthesizer you have or what kind of sound module. Sound modules and samplers generally have they can have real sounds in them like pianos, acoustic sounds in them like pianos, strings, bass guitars, stuff like that. Synthesizers are not really going to have strings and pianos because they can't recreate that sound very effectively. And drum machines could have synthesized drum machines like an 808, or it could have real drum machines like a drum kit type of thing. So, come on. There we go. All right. Okay, so here's how this all works. We've got 16 channels that we can use through a cable. And what I want to just point out about that is that this is considered a port, and the whole thing is going off of one port. So all three of these modules here, all three of these devices are on the same port, which is this one over here. So all three of these have to share 16 MIDI channels. And the way this works is there's 16 MIDI channels because all data is originating from one source. And each one of these modules is going to have what we call a receive channel. The receive channel sets which MIDI channel the device pays attention to. And that's going to be something that you set up internally inside the device. And it's going to be set so when you turn it off, it's going to come back on with the same receive channel set up. If you want to change it later, you can change it later. So for example, this module number 1 here, module 1, we set it for channels 1, 2, 3, and 4. So when I'm playing stuff on my controller or coming from my computer or whatever I'm doing, if it's playing all 16 MIDI channels out, this one's only going to be paying attention to channels 1 through 4. All the channels are coming into it, but it's only paying attention to 1 through 4. Everything else it's ignoring. And then all the data, all 16 of those channels, go through to this next device here as well. All 16 channels go through, but this one is set for 11, 12, 13, and 14. So it's going to ignore 1, 2, 3, and 4, and it's only going to be paying attention to 11, 12, 13, and 14. And then down here, the last one down here, are module number 3. This one here is only set for channel number 10, so it's only going to be paying attention to channel number 10. It is actually receiving all the MIDI data that these other ones are receiving, but only channel 10 is being acknowledged. Okay. So one other thing I've drawn into this picture here is audio left and right. The audio left and right here, and I've drawn that in because I just want to illustrate the point that audio is separate from MIDI. MIDI is separate from audio. So if you have audio, if you have a bunch of MIDI devices, you need a mixer. You need something like that. I've got a friend who I'm helping out now, and he's building his studio up, and he's buying a bunch of keyboards and stuff like that. And he's at the point where he needs to buy a mixer because he can't listen. He's gonna, like right now, he's like plugging the headphones in or plugging the audio into one device at a time, and he can't use them all at the same time because he needs a mixer. Okay. Now, let's talk about these devices here for a second. Let me just make sure that we're good over here. Yep, cool. All right. So these devices, we have multitimbral and non-multitimbral. This is talking about the device itself. A multitimbral device is a device that can play multiple instruments simultaneously. So it could play a piano and a drum kit and a bass and strings and a synth and all this stuff all at the same time. And it can receive several MIDI channels at the same time. So if we look over here, these first two modules, modules 1 and 2 here, these are both multitimbral, and they're set for multiple MIDI channels to receive on multiple MIDI channels. If we talk about a non-multitimbral device, this is a device that can only receive one MIDI channel at a time, and it can only play one instrument at a time. A lot of synthesizers, like modern synthesizers and stuff, are non-multitimbral. They only can receive and play one instrument at a time. Even if it's like something that costs $3,000, it's non-multitimbral. Multitimbral and non-multitimbral do not determine the price of something. You can have a multitimbral device that costs, let's say, $500, and you can have a synthesizer that's non-multitimbral that's also $500. It doesn't have anything to do with multitimbral versus non-multitimbral. It doesn't have anything to do with the price of something. The price is determined on how good it sounds, like how well it's made. Is it made by hand? Is it not made by hand? Is it made like on a conveyor belt factory in China, or is it made by hand, in a garage in America? Or Europe or something like that. These are the things that determine the price of stuff. So obviously if you get into really boutique synthesizers, and there are people who make boutique synthesizers, those are going to cost more because they're not just churning them out. It's just economics at work here, right? So my Mini Brute 2 here, this is about, I think this one's around $600 or $700 is how much that one cost. And my MPC, which is multitimbral, my Mini Brute here is non-multitimbral. It's $600 or $700. My My Sub 37, which I did not show you in the camera because it's just a bigger keyboard, that's also non-multi-timbral. That's about $1,200 or $1,400, depending on where you get it. So they're both, synthesizers, and they both make great sounds, but one costs, about half of the other one. And then you can also buy Behringer synthesizers. Behringer started making cheaper synthesizers, and those run from anywhere from $150 up to about $800 or so, depending on which one you get. And it doesn't mean that they're better or worse or anything like that, although some people would say that Behringer synths are maybe not as good. I don't necessarily agree. I think they sound fantastic, and most people of your audience aren't going to notice a difference anyway. So if you're looking for a cheap way into the synthesizer world, then the Behringer synths are pretty good. But again, we're going to come back and talk about all that stuff at another time. Now, let's talk about the instrument side of things. And just real quick, multi-timbral can have multiple instruments that it can play at the same time. Non-multi-timbral can only play one instrument or program at the same time. So let's talk about these programs / instruments, right? I say instrument in this case because that's like kind of a little bit more what it is referring to in a classical sense. So like, pianos, strings, guitars, drum kits, stuff like that. These are all instruments. In the MIDI world, remember, these are called programs. So instruments or programs can be monophonic or polyphonic. And this is not necessarily connected to whether the device is multitimbral or non-multitimbral, and this can be confusing. When it's multitimbral, we can have multiple instruments, but those multiple instruments, each one could be monophonic or polyphonic. It really depends on the instrument that you're playing. So for example, if it's a piano, it's going to be polyphonic. Piano, organ, strings, brass, that's polyphonic. Polyphonic can play chords. Monophonic, just play one sound, one note at a time. That's like a synth lead or a bass. No chords. That's the most easy way to remember this. Monophonic. Mono means one sound at a time, no chords. Polyphonic. Poly means multiple stuff. That means you're going to have chords. Okay, and I'm going to show you examples of this here in just a minute. So for example, if I have a Yamaha motif keyboard, that's one keyboard, it's one big keyboard, but it's multi-timbral. So each one of the Yamaha motif can play multiple instruments, like a piano, a bass, drums, strings. The piano will be polyphonic, the bass will probably be monophonic, the drums will be polyphonic, and the strings will be polyphonic as well. Okay. So let me just show you some examples of that real quick. I'm going to go in here to Pro Tools, and I'm going to make let's grab a couple of instruments. Let's grab two instruments here, and one of them is going to be polyphonic, and the one I'm going to use that's polyphonic is going to be Contact. Now, you probably do not have Contact, and that's okay. I'm just pulling up Contact because it's very easy to demonstrate polyphonic and monophonic. Now, Contact is actually multi-timbral. I can have multiple instruments loaded up here at the same time. I don't really recommend using it like that unless you're doing stuff live on a stage. I usually use Contact as a non-multi-timbral instrument. Just every instance of Contact has its own instrument inside of it. And that's mostly for mixing purposes and effects. So that's Contact right there. And now I'm going to load up over here. I will load up. Let's load up. Well, here, let's load up a CS80. So I can just show you this, like a good example of this stuff. All right, so the CS80 looks like this. This is from Arturia, and that is really ginormous. Let's resize that down to 80% so it's not taking up the whole screen, everything. All right, so this is CS80, and if I click on this, yeah, cool, okay. So this is a CS80 here. You can get lots of really cool sounds inside of a CS80, but let's go ahead and grab some keyboard sounds here. How is that a keyboard sound? there's one, but it's really quiet. There we go. Right, so I'm just playing that, and what I'm playing it on is one of my, I'm playing it on my big giant keyboard, and what I can do is, let's move this over here to this one so we can see my small keyboard. Boop, there we go. Cool. Hey, what we just got, you got knocked around there, buddy, didn't you? I put you back in the wrong place. There we go, okay. So we got that there, and so you can see I'm playing my keyboard. And, you know, that works pretty well. What I can do, though, is I can go over here. Let's play this other one here. And that's an example of polyphonic. And then over here, instrument number 1 here, this is contact. This one can also be polyphonic. And let's go down here. Let me just show you. What do I got in here? Here, let's grab a piano sound from in here. We'll grab una corda. Oh, actually, you know which one? Well, yeah, let's grab una corda. So I'm gonna load this up. It's a piano sound, so it's gonna sound like a piano, and it's gonna be polyphonic as well. So I got that there, that's polyphonic there. But let's grab something that's not polyphonic. Let's grab something that's monophonic. And so to do that, I'm going to go up to my synth sounds. Let's go to retro machines and mini lead here. Whoops. Take this out, put this in. Right, so you can see I can't play chords. I'm playing the keyboard, which should be chords, but it's not actually playing chords. So that's kind of what I mean by that. And over here on the CS80 here, this one as well, I think this one is probably only going to be polyphonic and not there's no monophonic, I think. Let's see, let's put lead here and see what happens. Big feller. Oh, okay, so this one also has monophonic mode as well. And in here somewhere, there's probably a button or a knob or something that says, you know, how many notes you can play and stuff like that at the same time. It might actually be up here somewhere. I'm not sure where it is inside of here, but yeah. I'd have to look for it and see where it says that keyboard control, low, high, ribbon, chorus, long, sustain, gliss. Yeah, I don't see it in here. So you know, keyboards, these things can be monophonic, they can be polyphonic, but it has to do with it right here. So this is non-multitimbral. I can only play this one sound at a time, whereas this contact here, I can actually have multiple instruments inside of here. So I could have like a drum kit in here as well. I could load up a drum kit. And now I've got a drum kit here. I've got my synth down here. I can load up multiple instruments, and that's multi-timbral. All right. Cool. So let's go back and talk a little bit more about MIDI musical data. Like I said before, the musical data is stuff like notes, velocity, things like that. So note on and off. This is actually quite important. It's going to come back, and we're going to be talking about this in a few weeks as well. So please remember note on off. Note on off is when you press a key on a keyboard and it plays that pitch. So if I play that one, it does that. Let me turn off the effects on here. Hold on one second. Let's go ahead and turn off our effects. How do we turn off our effects? Is it here? No, the effects is, I don't really use this one so much here. Let's do it let's use a different one. Something I do know how to use a little bit more. We'll use massive. So if I go into massive and I grab a lead sound, synth lead here, and all right, cool. So this one really doesn't have very much in the way of effects on it. It's got like a chorus, and sorry, I just turned off all the effects on it. So what happens is, if I press a key on my keyboard, let's pull this up here, it's going to send a couple things, note, number, and a velocity. So that's what the note on message. And the note on and note off are basically the same thing. One happens when you press the key, one happens when you release the key. So the note on and note off message are basically the same. They include the note number and the velocity. And yeah, that's the 90s dance music. Well, this is more of the, yeah, it's definitely the 90s, but they use it a lot in modern, like big beat and stuff like that. So here, the note on message, let me just pull up my keyboard so you can see what I'm doing here. There we go, cool. So if I press a key, you can see that one gets pressed over here. I'm pressing this one over here. Right, and each key I press, it plays a different note, and that's because it's getting the note on message. Now with this one, it doesn't actually have velocity in this one here, so you can't hear it if I hit it harder or softer for this particular sound. But that's also going to be part of your note on message there. So when you release the key on the keyboard, it does the same thing. It has a note off message, which has the same note number and velocity as the one that you played, hopefully. And it looks kind of like this down here across the bottom of my screen here. That's what we're kind of looking at there. I'm just going to keep my keyboard on here. You don't need to see my face. All right, now if you're playing, or if your sequencer is playing, like Pro Tools or whatever, sometimes you'll get a note that just hangs. So it'll be like, and it'll just keep playing that note like this. Well, when that happens, the reason why that happens is because the note off message never happened, and it never got the right note off, so it didn't turn that note off. It's kind of a weird MIDI thing. It's super annoying. It doesn't happen so much with Ableton Live, but it still happens with Pro Tools and Logic quite a bit, actually. All right, so let's go ahead and do this. Let's take a break. Let's do a 7-minute break or something. So come back at 10:40, and what we're going to do is we're going to dive into Pro Tools deeper. So we've finished the kind of overview of MIDI. That's the basics of MIDI there. It hasn't really changed much since the 80s. Now we're using USB cables and stuff like that, but that's the basic overview of it. We're going to talk about a few more things like knobs and stuff like that, especially when we talk about synthesizers. But this is what you really need to know for the time being. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and stop recording.